Okay, time for audience questions for the week. First question. Hey, David, why are people calling what Donald Trump did a quid pro quo instead of just calling it bribery or extortion? Very good question, and something I've been talking about for a while. The media cycles are basically referring to it as a quid pro quo. And what I realized was the problem was that there was a lot of debate over whether it was a quid pro quo without people knowing what quid pro quo means, which, of course, I think the gist of the Latin is you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Something for something else, something in exchange for something else. This for that. It is not in a literal Latin translation, although I think that it's generally accurate. When in reality, if you don't actually understand what that means, you might not understand that we're basically talking about actions by Donald Trump that would be bribery or extortion. So let's look at the definitions here. Quid pro quo, defined in English, would be a favor or advantage granted or expected in return for something. So it does describe what took place with "we need you to do us a favor," the military aid, smear investigations of Joe Biden by Ukraine and the Ukrainian President Zelensky. Quid pro quo is not an inaccurate term, but a lot of people don't understand it, and it's probably not a strong enough term. Bribery, on the other hand, the giving or offering of a bribe, which is a sum of money or other inducement offered or given to bribe someone, seems to me much more precise and actually much more indicative of the true sort of nature, scope, and severity of what has taken place. To bribe is to persuade someone to act in one's favor, for example, by smearing Joe Biden, typically illegally or at least dishonestly, or immorally, you could argue, via a gift of money or other inducement. It is literally what is believed, what is alleged to have taken place between Trump and the Ukrainian president. There was the attempt by the Trump administration, including on the July 25 phone call, but also beyond it, what led up to it, as we know in other conversations. The idea was, let's persuade Ukraine to publicly announce an investigation of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden for the purposes of hurting Joe Biden's chances in 2020 to help Donald Trump in exchange for a gift of money or inducement. In this case, it was military aid, money for the country. Now, what's interesting about that is the attempt to persuade on that basis is the bribery, regardless of whether the bribe is accepted or ever actually paid. And that is another reason why we really should be calling it bribery instead of quid pro quo. Quid pro quo, accurately or inaccurately, is often interpreted as one thing for the other, and the things are exchanged. When you look at the definition of bribery and what a bribe is, the language makes it much more clear that the attempt, the persuasion attempt, the inducement, regardless of whether it's accepted, still counts as a bribe, as an attempted bribe, as bribery. And that's really important. And then we also get to extortion. Now, the definition of extortion is the practice of obtaining something, especially money, through force or threats. So you can say that when you consider the geopolitical imbalance of power between the United States and Ukraine, you can reasonably make the case that when a White House, when the Trump White House tries to obtain smears on Joe Biden from Ukraine, they are using force and threats. Is it physical force? No. Trump is not saying he's going to show up and punch President Zelensky. It's not that. But when you consider the power dynamic, we could certainly argue that it is the use of force to obtain something from Ukraine, and that in that sense, it also qualifies as extortion. So these are certainly more commonly known and understood terms. I believe that they more precisely describe what it is that took place. So I think that we can't not use the term quid pro quo at all because it's still in the conversation. But I'm going to make an effort to say what is being described as a quid pro quo, it's actually bribery and even extortion. I think I'm going to start making that point every time. And I appreciate you bringing it up to me.